If you're new in town or just new to this whole podcast thing, you're tuning in to Lore by Night, the podcast that discusses all things vampiric with no fear of breaching the Masquerade. In this celebratory episode, I shall be discussing my thoughts and opinions on the 2018 video game Vampyr, the vampire game that got me pulled into the brilliance that is the world of darkness. For those who don't bother reading the episode numbers and the titles of the podcast, this is the 52nd main upload I have done. As I do one episode a week, this means that this episode signals the 1-year anniversary of the Lore by Night podcast, and I am beyond words as to how happy I am with how it has progressed since then. 1,000 YouTube subscribers in the first 8 months and 2,000 3 months after is just, well, ludicrous really, as is the amount of praise, love and support the World of Darkness community, the family, has showered me in. Is just overwhelming, and my insecure British ass just can't cope with it all. I am eternally grateful with how you have all embraced me into this world of darkness. You are all just some of the most lovely people, so you have my deepest and most sincere gratitude. But enough of that sentimental horseshite. You want to know why I'm touching this vampire game and not something Vampire the Masquerade related, don't you? Now, before you unsubscribe and blacklist me, hear me out. It was this game here, the vampire game I would purchase in April 2019, that would get me introduced into the world of darkness, as countless of game critics and reviewers kept bringing up a little vampire game called Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines. Vampyr would get me into LA by Night, which would get me into V5, which would get me into VTM proper, which would encourage me to do this podcast. I would say that this game, Vampyr, is one of great importance to the existence of this podcast and everything that has happened thereafter. So, it would only be fair if I would revisit and review this game, and I'm going to spoil a lot of this game, so proceed this review with caution. I was first made aware of Vampyr when its gameplay trailer appeared on my YouTube recommendation page late 2016. It was dark and gritty, and I liked what the game's narrative was implying. It also had vampires in it, which excited me as I love a good vampire story, in case you weren't aware. I noticed it was developed by Dontnod Entertainment, who are the people behind the Life is Strange franchise, so it had my immediate interest because of how different the presentation was and how it actually looked like a good game. It was supposed to be released in 2017, but was delayed and was released on the 5th of June 2018. When reviews started coming in, I felt that Vampyr quickly became the Marmite of video games. People either hated or loved it. Now, whilst this may seem unhelpful as to whether this is a game worth buying or playing, it was actually very helpful, as I summarised it was average at best and therefore made the decision not to buy it until I saw it on an average game price, which for me was £25. The game begins with a cryptic monologue that requires sandpaper to smooth off its edges, while showing a man with a beard at the docks being bitten by a vampire. You wake up in a pile of corpses, crawl your way out and bite a woman called Mary, who you quickly learn was your sister, sucking her blood in the process. Keep this image of the man gobbling up this woman for a later part of the review. You then run away from people rightfully trying to kill you, learning the game's stiff combat in the process. You play as Dr. Jonathan Reed, a title that you won't have to remember because the game does everything within its power to brand it in your subconscious. Him being a doctor plays into the story and to the gameplay to an extent, as you talk to various civilians and can prescribe medicine to them that you can make at hideouts, which is where you can also level up and stock up on ammo for the guns you find in this rather unique take on post-World War I London that is overrun by the Spanish flu, and amongst other things. You waste no time investigating how Jonathan has become a creature of the night, using your special vampire vision to see bloodstains and the blood flowing within your enemies and civilians/prey. These bloodstains lead you to a pub called the Turquoise Turtle, and this is where the game encourages you to talk to everyone you meet to try and find out about them, their life stories and anything they like or don't like in the world. It may not come to a surprise that there is a lot of talking in this game. When Jonathan starts working at Pembroke Hospital, people, I easily spent a good 2 hours talking to everyone inside, and this is where the game is at its strongest in getting you to feel for the characters and their problems, with some great voice acting for the most part found within these sections. I will admit that I was getting very annoyed with the amount of talking there was by the end of the game, as it dumped huge chunks of its story and world building onto you when it could have easily been given to a more organic manner towards the player and far more engaging as a result. You will also notice that civilians usually have some sort of social status with someone else, be it father or son, rivals or siblings, and it usually be the case that one is pro something whilst the other is anti something. There are not many voice actors in the game either, which is somewhat disappointing given the number of civilians there are. You can tell the elderly are younger actors straining to sound 30 to 40 years older than they actually are. Talking to civilians in the explorable 4 districts, Pembroke Hospital, Whitechapel, the Docks, and the West End, does serve a purpose beyond world building. You can suck the life out of almost every NPC you can engage conversation with, but doing so on your first encounter gives you a bit of experience points, usually a number between 500 and 800. Each time you learn something new about them, it increases the potency of their blood, with the highest being 12,000 experience points to give a rough approximation. Sucking people dry is the most efficient way of gaining experience points, providing they are healthy, as illnesses decrease the amount of experience points gained from embracing them. Compared to enemies, be it a vampire or vampire hunter, they only give you 10 to 20 experience points once you have eliminated the number of enemies on screen, not 10 to 20 experience points per enemy. It is strange that the deranged patient who believes she is a vampire can give you more blood than one of the healthy doctors, but who am I to argue with wacky video game logic? When you first meet a civilian, you will generally have nothing to talk about, or very little, as you have most likely have never heard of this person. You have various branching options to choose and come back to, which can sound a bit weird when Jonathan asks something to talk about something they briefly mentioned 5 minutes ago. To improve this, I suggest that when you play the game, you go clockwise through the branching narratives. When you find something particularly interesting about someone which is signposted by the game, a blue option is shown to the player, which allows Jonathan to use his special vampire persuasion powers to subtly force someone to talk about such fact. Most civilians will usually propose a question or a statement that you can give your opinion about. This is presented of one of 3 ways. You can either be a saint, a cunt, or you can give a more neutral response. Answer correctly and a character will reveal something about themselves or someone else. Answer incorrectly and nothing will happen. But answer really incorrectly and the game will tell you that you have lost a hint opportunity and maybe the opportunity to do their side quest, which the game calls investigations. It is not at all obvious which one you should choose, so you are left to your own devices to play it by ear. Unless you search it up online, of course. Many characters can offer investigations for you to complete during your playthrough, and the outcomes of most of them allow you to make a choice, which grants the player different rewards and may open up a hint about themselves or someone else. There are also some moments in the game where you have to talk to civilians, like at the beginning of the game, as part of the main quest, which has a yellow dialogue branch for you to choose. Whilst you don't find out interesting bits about the main character, the rare occasions offer insight into the main story characters. In the main story conversations, these options push the game forward and are recommended for players who have less patience than I and don't want to listen to every single thing about every single character. The one final way you can find out information about people is by eavesdropping on certain suspicious behaviors. Sometimes when you are using your vampire senses, 1 or 2 characters glow a bright red and the game tells you that these people are up to something. You must then go to a specified location to see what they are doing in the form of a short cutscene. Whilst these moments are rather interesting to watch, it is not clear where you need to stand sometimes to trigger the cutscene, which is very frustrating when you're trying to work out where to go so you don't miss the scene altogether if you don't have your wits about you. You have about a minute to try and work out where to go and stand to properly eavesdrop, otherwise you'll miss the cutscene and have to try again later, and by later I mean on a separate fucking playthrough. I mentioned earlier that chatting and questing to NPCs increases the amount of experience you get when you decide to suck their blood, which in turn makes them a fantastic source of making yourself more powerful with upgrades to your powers, health, stamina and blood gauge to use your powers, the power of your bite and blood-sucking capabilities on enemies. There are a couple things worth considering before embracing someone. You can't embrace everyone from the word go, and when I say embrace, I mean kill them, not turn them into vampires. Certain districts are locked off from the player until you reach certain parts of the story, and your mesmerized level has to be the same or higher than your target. this number increases during certain points in the story. The big dilemma you have with this, however, is that with every kill, it adds to the death and illness in London. Doing so lowers the sanity of a district, which increases the rate that people can become ill and eventually die. Should a district fall to the hostile status, anyone left alive will die, and traversing there will be more dangerous than it is already. There is also the question of morals, should you grow particularly close to a character's story, which may put you off your next meal. A patient in Pembroke Hospital, for example, wants to leave the hospital to work and feed his kids. Killing him would leave the children in a bit of a pickle, to say the least. During my second playthrough, I embraced someone's son and the father died the following night. He was completely well, so I could only presume he killed himself, which made me feel incredibly guilty, despite the fact I was deliberately going around killing everyone. Characters within their social group also remark about who died and how it has affected them, which can drag a tear from one's eye if potential/implied suicides and the final thoughts of your meal doesn't do that already. Should you choose to embrace someone, you have to guide them to somewhere quiet and alone. Embracing someone after that requires holding onto a prompt for a second, so it is not immediate and you are given plenty of chances to change your mind. Every district has one member who is described as the Pillar, who the well-being of all the civilians in a given district relies for their survival. A nurse who works at Pembroke called Dorothy Crane is the Pillar of Whitechapel, for example, who is a nurse that helps the migrants and refugees who can't read or speak English and gives them treatment. Killing her would mean everyone in Whitechapel falls ill at a much faster rate than before. As such, there are points in the story where you must choose what to do with each pillar, and it is not always obvious what to do with them to ensure their survival and the survival of everyone in the district. There is one pillar who will remain nameless that causes everyone in the game to become very ill if you leave them alive and not kill them. If you wish to be a nice vampire who doesn't kill innocents, you're going to have a very tough game ahead of you, as you are constantly going to be underleveled by a good 10 levels by the end, which forces you to upgrade your weapons and health more than your powers. It makes each enemy encounter incredibly difficult as you are very weak, and you have to think really carefully about stamina management and how you position yourself against up to 3 enemies. You are just as much the hunted as you are the hunter, and it is rather enjoyable for the most part. By the final quest, I was completely avoiding enemies altogether, which was just as annoying as it was exhilarating. That said, bosses are always nearly impossible when doing this sort of playthrough, as most are able to take you out with 3 hits if you don't pay attention. You have to actually learn their attack patterns and how much each one is going to hurt you should it hit you. A particularly difficult spike I had was fighting Mary Reed, Jonathan's sister, who has become a vampire for reasons not entirely made clear, which I will address momentarily, and it would appear that I'm not the only one who sees this. It is much easier to tackle bosses playing an overpowered bastard vampire, as bosses go down in seconds to the point you genuinely feel sorry for how weak they are. Coincidentally, the fight with Mary Reed is a very interesting one, for the conversation you have with her just before the fight will change drastically depending on whether you have been a morally good or bad vampire, which I would show you, but I do not want to lengthen this review much longer than it is. That and people listening to this on the podcast format are going to miss out a considerable amount. So let us move on to the game's narrative, which I believe is very interesting. However, it is one filled with many considerably large plot holes, and it doesn't take an observant player to notice them. The existence of Mary as a vampire is one of them. Sort of. An hour prior to the boss fight, you speak with Lady Ashbury, who feeds her first by sucking the blood dry for patients at Pembroke Hospital, with full consensus of Dr. Swansea, the owner of the hospital, your employer. Lady Ashbury informs you, should you ask her the appropriate question, that becoming a vampire is far more complicated than being bitten by one, but that is exactly what happens to Mary. You, a vampire, bite her and she turns. Now, the wiki says this concerning her transformation.
As he realizes he has killed Mary, Jonathan closely cradles her body. He inadvertently caused Mary's lips to come into contact with his own blood in his throat. He is forced to flee when vampire hunters began shooting at him, leaving Mary's body behind.
Watching this opening cutscene carefully, you can see that Jonathan does indeed bring her close to him, but it is not all that clear that she is close enough to him to touch his vampiric blood, and I don't think she is brought anywhere near his neck. This is reflected in the game's character and camera animations being rather poor when compared to the gritty voice acting. I would believe you if you told me that this was a game built by AI, as everyone in this game seems to be on Botox, which I found highly confusing, especially when the 2016 trailer had more animations and life to the world. Lady Ashbury is a character I find really annoying. She is introduced to the player as being an old and presumably powerful vampire, but she is against the primal behaviours one might imagine when you conjure a mental image of a vampire. It is unusual to see a character of her status act this way, as I would expect Jonathan to act in this particularly humane way, which he is for a time, which makes sense given he is a newborn vampire, a fledgling if you would. This of course stays or goes depending on the player's actions. I will admit that it's an interesting take on the vampire idea, but she is emotional to the point of being fragile, and I can't cope with people like that, especially when each conversation with her can last up to 30 fucking minutes. Then there is the relationship between her and Jonathan, which I personally find baffling. Because of my disdain for her character, whenever I was given an option to express my own opinion through Jonathan during my first playthrough, I would often choose the option I thought she would not like the most, that and I have a cruel sense of humour. There were options that would imply intimacy between the two, which in turn would suggest that there was an ending where they go off and fall in love in a castle or something. It turned out that I was pretty spot on in my self-jesting, as the two fall in love, regardless of your actions, for no good reason at all. One moment I was talking to her purely as a source of vampiric info and the occasional mission giver, and then the two start calling each other my love, and Jonathan on many occasions states how he cherishes her. I have no idea how or what I said that made her think I was into her, and I am concerned what she said that made Jonathan love her. Their relationship doesn't feel forced, but incredibly slapped on. There is also a strange disconnect between the world and the gameplay. You can have a chat with an NPC on the corner of a street, go around to the other side of that corner and find a scowl or ghoul or whatever you want to call it, a wight if we're going to use Vampire the Masquerade terms, chewing on a dead body. There are also large beasts that resemble werewolves that do the same, and you are left wondering why so many people are oblivious to it all. One group of enemies who are very much aware of it all are the guards of Prewen, who are vampire hunters, and their leader Geoffrey McCullum, who you fight in the latter part of the game. He can only fight you by drinking the blood of King Arthur, which he readily has in a flask. How he managed to get such blood is never answered, and how there is even blood of a corpse as old as that is beyond me. What's more, it is revealed that your maker is Midrin Wilt, which is the Welsh name given to Merlin, who does nothing but speak in pretentious cryptic riddles. He tells you that King Arthur is a vampire as well, which means that Geoffrey should be a vampire as well, but you are able to spare Geoffrey or turn him into a vampire. I could go on with more nitpicking, but the YouTuber Dartagon did a video singing the game already. I personally don't agree with all of his complaints, but I think most of them are pretty fair. The game itself also has quite a few technical issues that I would usually avoid talking about in great detail in reviews like this, as they are often single case moments, but the game here crashed 3 times. Each time something different happened. The first time occurred when I was just wandering around the map. The second time was when I created a custom waypoint on the map, and the third crash occurred just after leveling up. The game also has far too many loading screens as you wander around this tiny portion of London. It is a game that cannot cope with being fast, running from area to area constantly, which could be why I experienced those crashes. I also have to mention the most bizarre glitch I have ever encountered, and this is coming from somebody who's played various versions of Skyrim. To do this, all you will need is an unpatched version of the physical console copy of the game and a USB keyboard. Go to level up, choose an ability to level up, then just hold the P key and watch the experience points just go up and up and up. Whoever discovered this is quite frankly a weirdo. Vampyr, through all of its flaws, does present what I think is a very interesting and unique take on the vampire mythos. I really enjoyed playing Vampyr, despite my playthrough and not killing any civilians minus Clay Clocks, meaning everyone was as tough as nails by the end, that 40-minute epilogue with Lady Ashbury and William Marshall, the crashes, the loading screens, and the hours of civilian dialogue not actually affecting the main story. It is also incredibly fun going back and murdering everyone, hitting max level, which is level 50, and being a complete force to be reckoned with, eating everyone at Pembroke Hospital and anyone else I fancied, munch munch munch, crunch crunch crunch, Om nom nom. I do stand by my opening remark that Vampyr is most certainly 2018's Marmite game, as not everyone is going to enjoy sitting through its stiff branching narratives and almost dead cinematics. It is a game driven forward by its engaging yet bitty plot. Not everyone will enjoy smacking their head against a wall at the difficulty of latter game bosses because you haven't eaten anybody, but you, the player, are able to make those decisions and have to bear the consequences of your actions. You choose the difficulty curve. It is a fantastic vampire simulator, as the game allows you to determine how much of a monster you want to be, choosing when to strike and to take your prey, and I love that the difficulty of the game is dictated by the willpower of the player, whether they can resist the hunger, which is at the very core of Vampyr the Masquerade, just to tie that back into the branding of the podcast. I believe there is a lot of potential for this game to be developed into a cool franchise, if Dontnod is willing to smooth off the edges. Should there be more games like this, I beg that they use the same composer. I am very new to the works of Olivier Derivière, and I love how the menacing choir that I believe signifies the thirst for blood, and that tortured cello that takes center stage. It is a brilliantly guttural attack on the senses, and it is particularly frightening when the more peaceful cues in the districts become eerier as the health of the district declines. If I were to rate this game out of 10, I would give this I'm a Doctor out of 10, as that is just as helpful as a proper out of 10 score. To be kept updated, follow the Lore by Night VTM Twitter and Instagram pages to find out when we will upload each episode. You can also find out by subscribing to the YouTube channel and clicking on the little bell, as you'll be immediately notified when the latest episode is live. Until next time, farewell.